Our headline story: South Sudan has been hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. It has also battled lower international oil prices and severe floods in recent months. In a bid to help revamp the economy, the International Monetary Fund has approved a disbursement of over $174 million. Also, the international lenders' talks with Zambia have progressed. However, there are some hindrances to the talks. We'll get into these issues right after this. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. The Executive Board of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, has approved a disbursement of special drawing rights, about $123 million, to South Sudan under the Rapid Credit Facility. Now, this is equal to 50% of the quota, or about $174.2 million. The disbursement will help finance South Sudan's urgent balance of payments needs and provide critical fiscal space to maintain poverty-reducing and growth-enhancing spending. This is the second IMF financial assistance to South Sudan since it joined the IMF in 2012. The first was November last year. A sharp decline in international oil prices triggered by the pandemic and devastating floods have eroded the country's economic gains from the peace process. The economy is projected to contract by 4.2% in financial year 2020 and 2021. Away from South Sudan, the IMF has said headway is being made and that discussions will continue with Zambia. The Bretton Woods institution, however, said that work towards implementing Zambia's financial reforms to correct large financial imbalances and also ramping up revenues and improving governance was still needed. Joining me from Lusaka, Zambia, is Mtwalo Msoni, an economist and researcher. Mtwalo, thank you once again for joining us on Business Edge.
Thank you. Pleasure, Roman.
All right. So quickly, let's get into this South Sudan conversation. So they've gotten financial assistance from the IMF just a few months ago in November, now being approved for more financial assistance. But what were the economic conditions that have pushed South Sudan into seeking the IMF's further assistance after that first tranche of assistance in November?
Well, I think it's because of the currency depreciation, which has been closely linked with low oil prices, the humanitarian crisis in terms of floods, which has essentially pushed the nation in a position where they had to spend their reserves and run out of reserves. So this facility should be targeted at restoring parity to the balance of payments, which are essential for the currency to maintain some value and to at least depreciate at a lower rate than it's depreciating currently, because it makes the cost of importation quite expensive and puts the nation at an awkward situation with its lenders, in the sense that now it has to pay more in terms of local currency to finance its foreign debt.
Okay, so that's the situation that South Sudan finds itself. So we know that these type of loans, especially from people like the IMF, like the World Bank, they always come with some form of stipulations and requirements. What did South Sudan have to do to qualify for this loan, for this further assistance from the IMF?
Well, the IMF looked at a number of economic indicators which would be indicative of the country's ability to pay back the loan. So, of course, the loan that was received is under the special credit, and there will be no interest that is paid on the loan. But South Sudan essentially qualified because it stands as a low-income country and a country that has a good debt portfolio and proved to say it might pay back as oil prices maintain stability over the long term.
What are the details of this facility? What do we know? How will the money be used? Have programs and projects been outlined that are going to share in the financing, aside from, of course, the special needs balance that they need to address? So what projects is South Sudan going to continue in terms of this loan?
So like every IMF loan that's issued, I think it goes a long way in considering specific uses of the resources. And in this particular case, South Sudan is lucky because part of the resources will not only go to restoring parity in terms of international reserves for balance of payments, but the money will also go to paying some of the emoluments for the government workers who haven't been paid because of the situation that the country has been in. There haven't been enough resources to finance government payroll, so some of these resources will go towards financing government payroll. Some of the credit specifically is going to COVID vaccine and the country's COVID response. And some of it is going to finance day-to-day deficits. And it's important to mention that with this new facility that South Sudan has received, it basically frees up some of the revenues that are collected in form of domestic revenue mobilization from taxes in South Sudan for other immediate uses.
Okay. So as we said earlier, this is actually the second loan that the IMF will be granting South Sudan. In your estimation, even though it was just a few months ago, do you think South Sudan was able to judiciously use the first loan? Were they able to actually put it to the process and to the purposes that that loan was given for?
One of the things that the IMF noted when noting the difficult situation that South Sudan is in, of course, expected to contract at 4.2% in terms of economic growth, is corruption and resource mismanagement. And I think there have been lots of talk even before the loan was approved about how South Sudan will take practical steps to ensure that the scarce resources are being handled in a more prudent manner and corruption risks are dealt with. So for the first facility that was received, one of the worrying things was around government state corruption and how it will inhibit the performance of the grants and probably put the country at an awkward position to repay the loan. So this is something that has a current work plan, and the South Sudanese government is currently committing to address this. So if they can be able to address this, I think they might be in a position where they might manage to pay back on both loans.
Okay. So before we leave this South Sudan issue, part of this loan that they have now received from the IMF the second time is going to go towards the urgent balance of payments needs that South Sudan needs to attend to address to. So can you break that down for us? What urgent balance of payment needs? What exactly is that? What's the situation with South Sudan in regards to that?
So balance of payments essentially talk to what's leaving the country and what's entering into the country. It looks at the exports and imports. One of the things that's also considered in the balance of payments is the amount of reserves that you have. The balance of payment essentially determines how strong your currency is in, because it looks at the factors of demand and supply with regards to local currency, locally produced goods and services versus foreign goods and services. So what this facility is trying to do is trying to boost up the international reserves that South Sudan has, so as to try to maintain a strong position of its currency, which has been one amongst the weakest in the African continent, with the start of the COVID pandemic, which led to the decline in oil prices. All
right, so Mtwalo, let's hold on now.
Maybe just to add on there,
okay.
It's also important to note that in as much as a loan that's given to maintain balance of payments would not attract any interest, if the currency continues to depreciate, essentially the country would still have to pay more in terms of local currency to finance its debt obligation.
Okay, that does make sense there. All right, we're going to go on this break, but if you're watching, just hold on to this number, $250 billion. I'll tell you what that means when we come back. Still with me on Business Edge is Mtwalo Msoni, an economist and researcher based out of Lusaka, Zambia. Now, since March 2020, the IMF's executive board, under its various lending facilities and debt service relief, has financed the Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust, the CCRT. Now, overall, the IMF is currently making about $250 billion. That's the number I told you to hold on to. $250 billion, which is a quarter of its $1 trillion lending capacity available to member countries. But with literally every country facing an economic crunch, could this affect how much the IMF has to give to those who need assistance? So, Mtwalo, let's talk about this Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust. So, the IMF is making about $250 billion available, but everyone needs some form of assistance now. So, could this pandemic that is putting economic pressure on all of the countries around the world, could it reduce the ability or the amount of financial assistance that the IMF is able to give to those, let's say, in really dire situations?
Everyone wants money at this point. The net lenders are also seeking to borrow because of the unforeseen circumstance there is. The IMF is placed and is also in a difficult position because lots of countries are reaching out for relief. And there's lots of talk about reviewing the process that the IMF goes on to approve which country gets what amount at a specific point. So I think for this particular case, it's an ongoing discussion which is not going to end anytime soon, seeing that lots of countries are reaching out for this assistance, and the terms and conditionalities for accessing this loan are just not comprehensive enough, and it does not address an unforeseen circumstance like this one, where we would be in a pandemic and most nations would be in an economic crisis, and already existing debt crisis, which works against the ability to fight the pandemic.
So let's also now talk about the special drawing rights, the SDR, which is an interest-bearing international reserve that was created by the IMF in 1969. And that's basically to supplement other reserve assets of member countries. Now, the status of the reserve assets is derived from the commitment of members to hold, accept, and honor obligations that are denominated in SDR. But the question many people have often asked regarding this, Mtwalo, is who can influence who gets what? We've had conversations about the special drawing rights in the past few weeks, and we've seen some contributions, let me say that, from the G7 in regards to the SDR. And of course, you also have considerations to be made to China as well. Who really can influence who gets what?
It's of course the people who contribute the most to the IMF, first of all. I think essentially, even if we try to run away from it and say all member nations and the IMF are privy to the same privileges, I think the ones that contribute the most have the largest say on how the revenues would be spent and would bring back extra revenues in this a particular fund, which is interest-bearing. The challenge that is there with the special drawing rights currently is that most nations are looking at it as a possible source of revenue, and there's fear that there are no proper guidelines and guidance as to how this special drawing rights might be made use of, especially during the pandemic. Do we look at the countries that have most hard hit? Do we look at the ones that have been contributing the most? Do we do away with the interest-bearing part of the grant and so on and so forth? So these are very difficult conversations that are currently being had not only at IMF level, but at different nation levels, And I think there are quite a number of countries that are looking at the special drawing rights, and from my analysis, I think it's just not enough to meet everyone's financing demand.
Okay, so let's go to Zambia now, as we promised earlier on. So Zambia has been in talks with the IMF for more assistance. Can you give us an update on what the latest with this situation is? What's the latest with the talks between the IMF and Zambia?
The IMF completed a virtual mission to Zambia 2 weeks ago, and I think the biggest recommendation that came from the IMF, and if sorted out, we'll probably see Zambia finally benefit from an IMF facility, is an improvement in the spending of revenue and also in the collection of taxes. These are essential for the IMF because the spending speaks to how the loan will perform, and it essentially speaks to how able a country will be to pay back the facility in the given time frame. The revenue collection bit is also important because what is going to be paid back, of course, is going to come from domestic revenue mobilization. And these are the two key areas that the IMF touched on that need to be improved on in the Zambian context. Of course, previous missions dwelt much on asking Zambia to come clean on its debt portfolio, including not only from multilateral institutions, but also bilateral debt and Chinese debt in particular. So the transparency with regards to debt hasn't been as comprehensive, and currently Zambia is still in the phase of trying to realize a debt sustainability strategy, which currently misses lots of information on some of the debt that's contracted, how it's being used, and the plan to pay back.
Yeah. Okay, so before I let you go, you've touched a bit on what some of the financial reforms for Zambia should be. And as the IMF has said, there still is plenty of work to be done. But do you think that some headway has been made regarding reforming Zambia's financial situation, the economy as well, even in terms of this loan conversation with China in play, with other international lenders in play as well? Has there been some headway in getting a handle on Zambia's situation?
So in the previous 3 years, prior to 2020, the pandemic year, the Zambia Revenue Authority has collected a surplus on its targets for domestic revenue mobilization, and this has come as a result of improved compliance and the digitalization of tax platforms. There's much that needs to be desired. Of course, meeting a target does not essentially mean you're able to finance your own development. It might be the fact that the target has been set low, but from the Revenue Authority's end, we've heard of increasing measures to ensure tax compliance, which is inclusive of reforming rules around transfer pricing, trying to get the domestic laws and policies in line with what is recommended in the OECD BEPS framework.
Yeah.
And also from the Ministry of Finance level, there's a commitment currently in the 2021 budget, which is also reflected in the economic recovery plan, of trying to revise tax incentives and double tax agreements entered into by Zambia and different entities, and trying to see which ones do make sense and which ones are redundant, which would help also with the country's position in domestic resource mobilization.
Okay. All right, so we'll keep our eye on those countries and the developments there. South Sudan in conversation, well, not even in conversation, having had $172 million being granted by the IMF in terms of helping it through this economic situation. And Zambia still in talks with the IMF. So as there are updates, we will bring them to you. Mtwalo Msoni joining me from Lusaka, Zambia. Thank you, as always, for being on Business Edge.
Thank you. Pleasure is mine.
All right. So let's get straight into things as we wrap it up for you with NC4 to watch. And we start with the ACFTA Secretariat. That is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat and the UN Development Program have signed a strategic partnership to promote trade as a stimulus for Africa's socioeconomic recovery from the COVID-19 crisis and as a driver of sustainable development, particularly for women and youth on the continent. Now, according to the UNDP, the agreement was sealed by the Secretary General of the Secretariat and the UN Assistant Secretary General and the Director of the UNDP Regional Bureau. South Africa will start operating Unit 3 at the Kusile coal-fired power station this week, according to the state-owned utility Eskom. Experts agree that this is the halfway point in a long-delayed 118.5 billion rand project, which began in 2008. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, and an alliance of other top oil producers have agreed to boost their collective production by more than 2 million barrels a day over the coming months. The cartel is betting on resurgent demand as they and the rest of the world assess the economic consequences of the pandemic's trajectory. And finally, Nigeria's foreign reserves continued the downward trend, losing $178 million in March, according to figures obtained from the Central Bank of Nigeria. The reserves, which stood at $34.99 billion as of the end of March the 1st, dropped to $34.82 billion as at the end of March 31st. And that's it on this edition of Business Edge, and we're also wrapping up a fantastic week. Thank you as always for joining us. Head to our website and also to our YouTube channel if you've missed any of our business and financial conversations on these issues around the continent. And until next time, I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-Balogun.